Okay, well, I have another question for you, Jonas. Um, can you create, kind of related to what we were just talking about, can you create a new neural pathway in the brain? Or are we just stimulating a latent perception that's already wired into the brain? Maybe in one of these higher levels or that you spoke about that are overlaid on the more primitive brain. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the brain is plastic. So in neuroscience, we talk about neuroplasticity, which means how the brain can change. And the brain can physically change. It needs to change. That's how all of our learning takes place. If we couldn't change the brain, then we couldn't learn anything. And as you know, we're constantly changing. We're always different as a result of our experience. You and I have different brains now than we did when we started this conversation, because
Yeah.
we can prove that to ourselves by just remembering what we said. And because the brain is able to do that, it means it has changed in some way. And usually that involves, at some point in neuroscience, we thought that new neurons couldn't grow. We know that we can grow new neurons into adulthood now. Although most of the change that the brain does is probably at the level of synapses, of connections between neurons changing, either growing new synapses or connections that are there becoming stronger or weaker. So that's how the neural circuitry can change. And that's an important part of life. There are some kinds of plasticity that are greater during early life. There are plastic periods. There's critical periods where it becomes difficult or more difficult to learn things after a certain period in life. But yes, the brain is plastic.
I'm glad it's so easily trained here. Yeah, I think the idea that you can actually grow new neurons and create, synapses that weren't there before is what's most important to me in my field, because Milton Erickson, who was one of the sort of precursors to neurolinguistic programming, used to say that healing is caused by the reassociation of experience. And a lot of NLP, neurolinguistic programming, is based on reorganizing one's experience that's already there into different configurations, so that it actually is what you're talking about. It's creating new connections. What thrilled me about the whole thing is that you could do it by talking. Who knew that you could create a new neural connection in the brain simply by referencing something that a person couldn't think of when they're in pain and putting it right next to the pain, and it did something inside people so that they actually had a change. So is that what's happening in some ways? Would you hypothesize?
Yeah, that's one form of learning. I mean, associative learning. The brain tends to associate things that co-occur. It's an important form of learning that is involved in so many different aspects of the mind.
Okay. Well, so here's another question I have that people ask me a lot. They ask me, what is the value of putting so much energy into visualization? And so the question is, can visualization actually create the new neural connections? And is it true, this phrase from a while back, that neurons that fire together wire together?
Yeah, that's a phrase from the neuroscientist Donald Hebb, and he proposed that as one of the mechanisms by which neural connections could change. That simply two neurons that are connected with each other, if they tend to fire at the same time, a stronger connection between them. That's probably true under a lot of circumstances. I guess it's important to note that the specifics of what the neural mechanism is for how the learning occurs doesn't necessarily matter for us psychologically, as long as we can see that the learning takes place.
Yeah.
The other part of your question about visualization is interesting, because this is something that I've been very interested in, is how the brain can simulate reality. And visualization is one form of simulation, where you can use the visual machinery of your brain to conjure up visual images, even when you're not actually looking at them. You can also conjure up motor images, imagine doing something, for example. And there is a big literature showing that these kind of imaginative processes can lead to learning. So, for example, if I'm learning how to shoot free throws in basketball, and I spend some time imagining standing at the free throw line and shooting, that actually improves my performance, just the imagination of it, the simulation. Because the brain is able to go through the motions to rehearse a lot of the computations that happen in the real thing, it can improve through those kinds of imaginative processes.
It helps a lot I think, for people to understand that, because a lot of people don't really believe in the power of visualizing. And it's just so powerful, because when you start to become more conscious of your images that you're just naturally making every day, it's fascinating to start watching that before you do something. Oftentimes there is the image of doing it. For example, with people who have eating issues, oftentimes what they'll be doing is following the image that they have in their head of seeing themselves eating something before they go do it. It's fascinating to me. So I think imagery is just amazing, the power of it and what it can do for us, and how also it can stop us from being able to get done what it is we want to get done. There are popular energy psychology tools like emotional freedom technique and tapas acupressure technique. Are you aware of those at all?
Very, very little.
Okay.
As I understand, they're sort of controversial in the world of academic psychology, as to whether the scientific evidence supporting the effectiveness of them is real or not. But I don't have a say in that, because I really don't.
Okay. Well, I use those tools a lot with clients, and I think a lot of people do these days use these tools. They're very much out there in the world. When I use it with a client, 95% of the time, the result that it promises does occur, in the sense that the emotional charge that was operating on the circumstance or the situation or the limiting belief is greatly reduced after doing the process. And that's according to the person. So, their feeling, their ability to access that emotion the intensity of it is down a lot, which gives them more clarity. So even though there's not been a lot of results around that, would you hypothesize? I mean, I'm just curious, how can that happen? Because what you're doing in these techniques is you're wallowing in the actual negative experience. You're actually putting your attention on it and attempting to make it stronger. So is there anything, even though there's no studies on it, is there anything that you could say on that might help us understand why it's working? Because I don't know why it works.
Yeah, I mean, again, this comes back to how good the brain is at simulation, and how when the brain simulates an experience, there really is a lot of overlap between the real experience and the simulated experience. Just to go back to visualization for a moment.
Okay.
We visualize something. We actually activate the visual cortex in a way that's specific to what we're visualizing. It's like the brain is using the canvas of the visual cortex to recreate the images that are very much like what we actually see when we use our eyes. And the same thing is true of emotional experiences. When we imagine emotional experiences, we actually create in the body many of the same responses that happen when we experience a real emotion. And we know from exposure therapy that when we experience something very strong over and over and over again, we habituate to it. So one potential mechanism here is that by bringing up these feelings, we're in a sense doing a kind of simulated exposure therapy, and the response that we have to those things reduces over time.
That's interesting. I know a lot of the ways that I approach it is that part of the reason, at least subjectively, that people share with me is when they believe something is true, it almost always has a high emotional component with it, a commitment, an emotional commitment with it. And whenever we do these tools that I'm mentioning, the energy psychology tools, a lot of time the emotional charge appears to be very decreased for whatever reason. It's just the ones you're talking about. Consequently, the amazing thing that I find interesting is that people's feeling of that as having truth to it diminishes as well. So to me, that's just fascinating, because, you can really believe something is true. And then 10 minutes later, you go, well, that's just an idea. You're like, what?
Yeah, that is interesting. The connection between feeling and belief is something that I'm very interested in. And the emotion surrounding what we believe often does help keep us rooted in those beliefs and make it difficult to change them. What you're saying reminds me a little bit of the that effect where when you say a word over and over again and it starts to lose its meaning a little bit, and you just hear it as its sound.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. I had another question there, but it just went away from my brain. So I think the issue that I want to continue on in our next segment is a little bit more focusing on what happens in the brain in the presence of again, the conflicting emotions, conflicting feelings, conflicting directions to go in. So hang in there. We'll be right back.